Everybody, and welcome back to Be Like Christ. It's me, Luke's evil twin, here to do the video study today. I had to wear my glasses. My eyes are irritating me to no end, and I think this might only be like the second video I've ever made with glasses on. Nonetheless, Matthew chapter 24 is the topic of discussion today. Let me just tell you, this is a hard chapter. I took some extra time to go through it and to study it. And if anyone ever tells you that there's not hard chapters in the Bible, either they're just lying to you or they're oversimplifying the Bible. I don't ever want to be afraid to admit that something is difficult, and there are some difficult passages in this chapter. Some of it is understandable and easy enough. Some of it's hard. We'll get into that as we do this. I have 23 pages of notes, and the reason that I did that was because I wanted to give this a thorough treatment. We are not going to go over all 23 pages as we typically do. I'm going to go through this, just teach through the text, reference my notes a little bit. But I definitely encourage you to go back and get those notes, because there's a lot of information in those that's not going to be present in this video, and a lot of it will be helpful in clarifying a lot of the information. There's also a lot of historical background here that we need to dig into, and I've included a lot of historical points in the notes that aren't going to be in this video for the sake of time. So let's get into this. There's some important things to remember as we look at this chapter. Number one, and probably most important, keep it in context. This text is so confused by so many people because they don't keep it in context. And it can be difficult to understand all of the pieces here in context, but we can do it, I'm sure. Second thing, and that is that there's really two parts to this chapter. Let me point them out, and then we'll go through them, as we go through the text. But here's the two parts. The first part, it's all based on a question that's asked by the apostles in the beginning of the chapter. They say, when are these things going to take place? And what are going to be the signs of your coming and of the end of the age? Seems like they have two questions there. One's about the destruction of Jerusalem. One's about the end of time, the end of the age. We'll get into that in a second. But Jesus is going to take the first part of the chapter through verse 35 to answer the first part of their question about the destruction of Jerusalem. He's then going to take the second part and into chapter 25 to talk about the end of the age, or the end of the world. So with that in mind, well, let me point out one other verse very quickly. That's verse 34. In verse 34, Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." Jesus says in verse 34 that all of the things that he had just discussed were going to take place in the lifetime, in the generation of those who were living, who he was actually speaking to. That's a huge point to keep in mind as we do our interpreting, because it keeps us from running off to, some day that hasn't happened yet to put these words and to interpret them that way. We have to understand this as these things happened during the lifetime of the apostles. So what was it? What is Jesus talking about? So all of that is hugely important, and we'll dig into it now. Let's read verses 1 through 2. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Chapter 23, Jesus has just condemned the Pharisees with all those woe statements, and then he's made two key statements towards the end of the chapter. The first one is that the house of the Jews is going to be left to them desolate when they filled up the measure of their fathers. The second one is that they are not going to see him again until they say, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." We talked about that statement about leaving the house desolate. We talked about how that's almost certainly a reference to 70 AD. I think chapter 24 will confirm that. In 70 AD, the Romans destroyed the temple, or the house of the Jews. The second statement, as we just mentioned, is about the end of time. All the Jews will bow the knee to Christ, even those who didn't accept him on earth, saying, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," the same confession that was made at the triumphal entry. So the apostles, they're now leaving the temple. And the apostles are probably shocked by the words that Jesus has just said. I mean, the temple was an amazing structure. To think that it was going to be gone, that it was going to be desolate within their lifetime was probably, almost unthinkable. So they're pointing out kind of the glory of the temple, and they might be doing that to say, "Lord, how is all of this going to be destroyed? But anyway, they're pointing out its beauty, its grandeur. And Jesus says, on this temple, there's not going to be one stone left upon another. That obviously prompts the apostles to ask some more questions, as we would if we were in that situation. And so they leave Jerusalem. They go up to a place called the Mount of Olives, which is to the east of Jerusalem, and they ask their question there. Verse 3. As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" We talked about this a little bit in the introduction. Their question is, when will these things happen? What are they talking about? What are these things? Well, the two statements made in chapter 23 probably, and also the statement that Jesus has just made when they were leaving the temple, that not one stone is going to be left upon another. When are those things going to happen? What will be the signs of your coming and of the end of the age, the end of time? Now, the apostles might have thought that they had just one question there. They might have thought that the destruction of Jerusalem and the end of time were going to be the same event. That wasn't the case, as we find out, and we now know. And Jesus is going to clarify this for them. There's some debate about what the end of the age means. I thought the best way to look at that is probably just to look at the ways that it's been used already in the book of Matthew. Matthew chapter 13, verse 40, with the parable of the wheat and the tares. It says there, just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so it will be at the end of the age. That's clearly a reference to the end of time. Verse 49 in the parable of the net, there's that same separation of the righteous and the good, and it says, so it will be at the end of the age. So how does Matthew use that term? He uses it, and how would Jesus use the term? He had used it to refer to the end of time. So that seems to be what they're asking about here. Okay, so we have the two questions. Now Jesus is going to answer, well, what do we know? We know that the end of time hasn't happened yet, or else you wouldn't be sitting here listening to my voice. What has happened? The destruction of the temple has happened. We know now, being a little bit further in time than Jesus, that happened in 70 AD. We'll get into that a little bit if you don't know the history there, but we know that happened. So Jesus, remember in verse 34, he says, all of the things that I'm saying prior to verse 34 are going to happen in this generation. So we understand that this first part of the question is answering the first part of their question. When are these things going to happen? When's the temple going to be destroyed? When's the house going to be left desolate? That's the first part of their question. That's the first part that Jesus is going to answer. Verse 4 and 5 then. And Jesus answered them, see that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. Jesus doesn't give them a direct answer. This is an extended answer. He says that many false Christs are going to come. Many false prophets are going to come. And we know that was certainly true. The man Josephus was a Jew who was a historian who wrote about first century Palestine and the events that occurred, especially about the destruction of Jerusalem. I've included a lot of his writings in the notes, but we're not going to have time to read it all. He gives several instances of false Christs or false prophets who led people and claimed to have the authority of God behind them. Interestingly, some of these people are also referenced in the biblical text. Theudas, Judas, some of these others. There's a whole section in the notes there about those individuals and what they did and how they led people astray. So Jesus says, when I leave this earth and go back to heaven, after my death and resurrection, there's going to be people who come claiming to be me, claiming to have my authority, and you need to be watchful for those people. Verse 6, 7, and 8 now. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nations will rise against nations and kingdoms against kingdoms, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places, and all these are but the beginning of birth pains. He says there's going to be wars, there's going to be famines, there's going to be natural disasters, there's going to be earthquakes, there's going to be rumors about wars that may or may not be happening, and all of these things are just are going to happen. But that doesn't mean, he says, that the end is coming. It's imminent. It's coming right now. It's still true today that anytime natural disasters or wars or coronavirus strikes the world, people immediately start to think, is this the end? And part of the reason for that is because they take statements like these signs and they try to apply them to the end of time. Well, Jesus just isn't doing that here. This is about the destruction of Jerusalem. But even he says here, when you see those things, those aren't necessarily the mark of the end. He says these things are going to happen all up until the point of the end. This is the beginning of birth pains. Like a woman who goes into labor, she'll start her labor pains, but that doesn't mean that the baby's coming like right now. It's just not going to like drop out of there and be in your lap. It might take hours still. So it's the beginning of the process. And that's what Jesus is saying here. The destruction of Jerusalem. You're going to hear about wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes. It's only the beginning. Keep your eyes open. Not there yet. In Antiquity of the Jews, which is a book written by Josephus, he records a great famine that occurred during Claudius Caesar's time. That's also mentioned in Acts chapter 11. There are numerous wars, skirmishes that take place in the Roman Empire and in Palestine during the time between Jesus is speaking in 70 AD. There was a magnitude 5, this says it was anywhere from 5 to 6.5, an earthquake that hit around the area of Pompeii during this period at 62 AD. They think that might have had to do with the eruption of Mount Vesuvius later on that destroyed Pompeii, but that happened during the time that we're talking about here. So all of those things recorded in history, but didn't mean that the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple was like tomorrow. Verse 9. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Were the apostles persecuted? Yeah. Jesus has just said in chapter 23 that the Pharisees and the scribes are going to fill up the measure of their fathers. They're going to persecute God's people even more, or just like their fathers did, they're going to persecute God's people. And we know from reading the books like Acts or the epistles that was happening even during the time after Jesus had ascended. Verse 10 through 13 now. Sorry if I'm going quick. I'm trying to do this in one video. I don't want to make it extraordinarily long. So if you have questions, leave them down in the comments. Love to hear some of those. Or comments or criticisms, hatreds, hate mail, any of that. Hate mail is my favorite. Especially those nasty comments that have like nothing to do with your video. Those are the best. Anyway, verses 10 through 13. Then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another, and many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. There's persecution that's going to come, and there's going to be many who fall away because of that persecution. Not only, though, are these people who fall away going to be content to fall away themselves and give up on their Christian convictions, but they're also going to encourage other people to do the same thing. And there's going to be persecutions that come from within and from without, in this case. They're going to encounter false teachers who are tricky, who are hard to figure out if they're genuine or not. Paul talks about that in 2 Corinthians. He says, "For such men are false apostles, deceitful workers, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ." They are coming in the name of Christ, but they're ultimately fakes. Verse 12 reads, "And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold." Many who loved in the past, that love is going to grow cold because of the abundance of lawlessness that's going on around them. I was listening to a podcast the other day. It was actually talking about the country of China and how China, how the nation was, all of the systems had become corrupt. And corruption was just part of culture. If the health inspector came to your restaurant, you just gave him money and he went away. There was no actual inspection. How if companies would pay you under the table just because they didn't want to pay as many taxes, right? It's just ripe in their culture. It's just part of the way things work there. He's talking about this and how he went to China, and his plan was that he was not going to be corrupted by this. He was going to have a moral high, he was going to stay on the moral high ground. And he just began talking about how it had just like crept into his life almost unaware. The culture was so consumed in it that it was almost impossible to function in that society in any reasonable way without participating in some of it yourself. And he admitted that he had kind of given in to some of these things over the years. And this is, I think, kind of the idea that we have as we're looking at this. When everyone around you is doing the wrong thing, it's really hard to do the right thing. When other people are mistreating you, it's hard to love your enemies. And he says the love of many people will grow cold because there's just lawlessness everywhere around them. And we'll talk about some of that lawlessness when we discuss the history behind the destruction of Jerusalem and the events leading up to it. The apostles had been commanded to turn the other cheek and to go the extra mile, and when sued, to give somebody your cloak and your coat. Well, this is kind of where the rubber met the road, and a lot of people wouldn't be able to do it. They wouldn't be able to love even in the face of tremendous lawlessness. But Jesus promises them if they are able to endure, then they will be saved and they will be with him. Verse 24 verse 14. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. During this time, the gospel is going to be spread out all over the place. We know that, Paul was part of that, taking the gospel to the nations. Notice he says all nations here. Keep in mind, the gospel hadn't gone to the Gentiles yet. The apostles probably thought, oh, this is just a Jewish gospel. This is Jewish good news for our nation, but Jesus is to all nations. And so we see a little bit of the a prediction or a telling that the gospel is going to be expanded within this period between these words being spoken and 70 AD. And we know that that happened first at Cornelius' house in Acts chapter 10. Verse 15. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. This is where things start to get a little bit sticky, but we are not unable to understand them. What on earth is the abomination of desolation? If you punch that into Google, the amount of things you get, the amount of like wild and crazy ideas about that are just like unlimited. Like you can spend hours and hours. And we could probably spend an entire class just discussing this one topic, but we don't have that much time. We're only in the first book of the New Testament. So we're going to give the brief synopsis. Abomination of desolation. That sounds really, really daunting. But if you're familiar with the prophet Daniel, you will know that language appears there. Daniel chapter 9, verse 27 talks about the abomination that makes desolate. Chapter 11, verse 31 and 12, verse 11 also make reference to the abomination of desolation, or very similar language to that. So this is not a concept that Jesus is just like pulling out of the air right here and kind of adding to the biblical canon. It's the idea is already here. The concept is already here. So rather than just kind of interpreting this like guesswork, what we should do is go back to the Old Testament, look at the prophets, look at the way that they used it, and then come up with an interpretation. Because especially in Matthew, as we've already talked about, he's trying to prove that Jesus is the Messiah of the Old Testament. And think about how many times he's referenced back to the Old Testament to show the identity of Jesus. Jesus is all about referencing the Old Testament to prove that he is who he claims to be. And that it only makes sense that that's what he's doing here. So when we interpret it, we need to do that in light of the evidence that the Old Testament reveals to us. Many people think that the abomination of desolation is a specific term referring to only one historical event. Some people think that's already happened. Some people think it hasn't happened yet. I actually don't think that's the case. I think the abomination of desolation is more of a general term, and it has at least two fulfillments, I guess you could say, in in the Bible, and that those have passed. Those are in the past. And let me tell you which events I believe those are. In Daniel 9, verse 27, the term, what is the term? The abomination that makes desolate, comes right at the end of his discussion of the 70 weeks. Now, when you do the examination on the 70 weeks, I think the best and really the best explanation is that the abomination that makes desolate in Daniel 9, verse 27, is a reference to the destruction of Jerusalem. But if you look at chapter 11, verse 31, and the context there, which is different in my view, he's talking about an event that actually happened about 200 years before Jesus, when Antiochus Epiphanes in 165 not desecrated, but disrespected the temple. The sacrifices ceased for a period of time that were going on in the temple until Antiochus Epiphanes was kind of, thrown out and things were able to be restored. So, I think Daniel 11 is a reference to that. Daniel 9 is a reference to what Jesus is talking about here in the destruction of Jerusalem. And Jesus actually references back to Daniel's words. I'm pretty sure he's referencing back to the events in Daniel 9. He's saying this is what Daniel was talking about. The temple is going to be defiled. It's going to be defiled in an abominable way. And let's see, where do I want to pick up here in my notes? If you don't know the history behind Antiochus Epiphanes and the 70 weeks of Daniel, if you're new to the Bible and that's something you're like, what on earth is he talking about? That might not be the first study you want to do in the prophets, but Daniel's a great book and it helps us to understand the New Testament a lot. And if you want to tackle it, go ahead and I'd encourage you to do it. But anyway, back to where we were. So this abomination, the Hebrew term abomination is used several times in the Old Testament, and it almost always has reference to idolatry or pagan worship or immorality. So the temple is going to be made desolate in an abominable way. The imagery is of paganism or of idolatry or of disrespect to the things that are holy, the things that God asks us to honor. The desolation foretold by Jesus would come at the hands of wicked and abominable men, and the destruction of Jerusalem certainly fits that picture in 70. And it would absolutely classify as a desolation because the Romans are going to come in and just destroy everything. So, not to mention, I think one of the best evidences that this abomination of desolation is a reference to the destruction of Jerusalem is Luke chapter 21. So there's two parallel passages to this one in Matthew 24. The first one is Mark chapter 13. The second one is Luke 21. Luke 21 doesn't use the language of abomination of desolation. There, Luke records the words, Jesus saying, "But when you see Jerusalem compassed with armies," that's in place of the abomination of desolation. Now that makes a lot of sense. Luke is probably writing to a more Gentile audience. They may not be familiar with Daniel's writings. The Jews that Matthew's writing to are much more likely to be familiar with those writings. So Luke just kind of spells it out plain. He says, when you see Jerusalem encompassed with armies, then you're going to know that this is the abomination of desolation, that you need to take action. And the action that they need to take is going to be talked about in the next couple verses. Before we do that, let's talk about the destruction of Jerusalem. I know that I've referenced that a lot of times. If you're familiar with biblical history, you might know a little bit about that, but let me just give the quick summary. And again, there's a huge amount of information in your notes of important historical notes that we're not going to mention here. What is the destruction of Jerusalem and why did it happen? Well, the Jews didn't like Roman rule. So in the 60s AD, there's a bunch of rebellions. The Zealots and some others rebelled in Jerusalem and kind of overthrew the Roman authorities that were there. Well, obviously, that doesn't go too well with the Romans. They're not going to be too happy about that. They're not just going to let it go. the Jews had been a thorn in their side for a long time, and they just decide, this is it. This is the end. We're done with these people. So General Vespasian takes an army, goes down into Palestine, puts down a lot of rebellions, a lot of riots and protests and things like that, kills a lot of Jews, and he's making his way down to the city of Jerusalem. When he finally gets there, part of the city is encompassed. He then goes to Caesarea. Vespasian goes to Caesarea, and he's about to send his entire army down to Jerusalem because they're just going to wipe out the Jews' most sacred city and be done with them. But, no doubt by the providence of God, Nero dies. Nero is the emperor of Rome. He dies when Vespasian is in Caesarea, and Vespasian decides, I'm not going to take any action yet, because he's in a position to claim the throne of Rome, to become emperor, to become Caesar. Because whoever controls the army controls Rome, basically, and that's him. Just ask Julius Caesar. He says, not going to move against Jerusalem right now. Instead, what I'm going to do is wait this out. So there's a bunch of civil issues in Rome. There's 3 emperors that rise and fall from the throne: Otho, Vitellius, and Galba. And after all that happens, and they rise and then get dethroned after sometimes a period of just a few months, Vespasian claims the throne of Rome, and he becomes the emperor. So he's kind of turned his sights away from Jerusalem at this point. He goes back to Rome, claims the throne, and what he has to do is make sure that the empire is kind of all in one piece and behind him, and that the entire empire has, their loyalty is to him. In order to do that, he has to go down to Alexandria to make sure, in Egypt, to make sure that Alexandria is on his side, and so he does that. Now, Jerusalem is by itself. You would think that they would all be, kind of getting along and maybe thinking, we need to make peace with the Romans. Guess what? They're not doing that. In fact, one of the things that Josephus reveals that is not revealed in a lot of... When I've heard this explained, a lot of this isn't explained along with it, but I think it's really important. When Vespasian pulls back his armies, and when he's in Rome and Alexandria and things like that, there's actually more wars going on in the Jerusalem area. It doesn't have anything to do with the Romans, but when the Romans pulled out, there was kind of a power vacuum that was created. And there are 3 prominent warring Jewish factions that are fighting each other when the Romans pulled back. What happens is that all 3 of these factions move into the city of Jerusalem, and they start a war in the city of Jerusalem that goes on for several years, or at least several months. And they're all vying for control and supremacy in the city. Now, the people of Jerusalem are kind of like the victims of this war. As if the Romans hadn't done them enough damage, now they're just doing damage to themselves. And one thing that Josephus points out is that these warring factions were keeping people from deserting the city. So they were keeping all of the citizens inside the walls. We often think that the Jews who were trapped in Jerusalem were trapped there because the Romans trapped them. That wasn't necessarily the case all these times, right? Sometimes it was the Jews within the city who were warring against one another that wouldn't let the Jews desert, the common Jews, out of the city of Jerusalem. So it's not as if there was this massive window of time between the pullback of Vespasian and the arrival of Titus, Vespasian's son, to finish the job that Vespasian didn't do in Jerusalem. Actually, the window to get out of the city is significantly smaller than that, because the only time that they had to get out of the city was when the Romans weren't there to keep them in, and when the warring factions let their guard down and let people slip out of the city. Okay, that was what was going on there while Vespasian is in Alexandria. And then from Alexandria, he decides, you know what, I'm not going to go back to Jerusalem. I'm emperor now. I got bigger stuff to do than mess with the Jews. I'm going to send my son Titus with 4 legions back to Jerusalem to finish this job. And so that's what he does. So he arrives at the city to find these warring factions not getting along and fighting one another. And then the warring factions realize that they've been surrounded, and they're like, oh, maybe we should team up for a while and get deal with this external problem. So that's what they do. They mount some attacks against the Romans, and they're semi-successful. But then Titus kind of locks them into the city, and they can't get out. And he's determined that he's just going to starve them out. He does that for a while. He arrives about April, right about the time of the Passover. So there's a lot of Jews who have come into the city for the Passover. And what's interesting is that the warring factions allowed them to come into the city, but they wouldn't allow them to leave. About that same time, Passover, Titus comes, he surrounds the city. No one's getting out at that point. The Jews inside, the ones who want supremacy, they don't want people deserting to the Romans. Josephus writes that Titus, the Roman, he would have given the Jews security. He would have let them, maybe sold them as slaves, but he would have kept them alive. And so many people wanted to desert to the Romans, but the Jews inside the city wouldn't allow them, and they would just kill anyone who they found deserting. We'll get to that in a second. But Josephus also records that there were a few windows in which a lot of people escaped. The warring factions were distracted, fighting one another, and people were basically running out of the city. And interestingly enough, Josephus writes that Titus just let them go. Like, he wasn't really that interested in killing citizens or even selling them as slaves, because there was such an abundance of slaves that the price was so low anyway, it was hardly worth it. So Josephus says a lot of these people ran out of the city, escaped their own Jewish persecutors, and Titus was just like, see ya, go do, go be free somewhere else. And we're told by writers like Eusebius, who writes a couple hundred years after Josephus, that no Christians were killed in the siege because they heard the words of Jesus that we're about to read, his instruction for them to take action when they see these things, and they escaped the city. We don't exactly know when exactly all of the Christians escaped. There are several windows in which it could have taken place, but that's one occasion that Josephus records that people left the city and Titus just let them go. So those might have been the Christians. Okay. Titus has surrounded the city. The Romans have got it pinned in on all sides, and the Jews will not surrender, namely the Jewish faction leaders. Now, when they've been warring among themselves, one of the factions has made the temple complex their stronghold, their base. They just basically decided our fortress is going to be inside of the inside of the temple complex, which was not what the temple was supposed to be for. And as we think about the temple being desecrated, or the abominations that were inside of the temple, I'm not so sure that some of the abomination of the temple actually happened before the final and ultimate abomination of the Romans destroying it. What we find is that the Jews in their own city are desecrating the temple and the holy things because they're fighting amongst themselves. I do want to read this one passage from Josephus, if I can find it. Yeah, here it is. There was literally a war going on around the walls of the temple and inside the temple. People had come to offer sacrifices at the Passover, and this is what was happening to those people. Let's see. Let me read. Okay, this will work. Josephus writes, "For notwithstanding, these men were mad with all sorts of impiety. Yet did they still admit those that desired to offer their sacrifices." So the people who were held up in the temple, they were impious, Joseph says. But they still allowed people to come into the temple to offer sacrifices. Interesting. Although they took care to search the people of their own country beforehand, and both suspected and watched them. While they were not much afraid of strangers, who, although they had gotten leave of them, how cruel soever they were, to come into that court, were yet often destroyed by this sedition. So he's saying the people who came in to offer their sacrifices were often destroyed by the war that was going on all around the temple. For those darts that were thrown by the engines came with that came with that force that they went over all of the buildings and reached as far as the altar, the temple itself, and fell upon the priest and those that were about the sacred offices, insomuch that many persons who came hither with great zeal from the ends of the earth to offer sacrifices at this celebrated place, which was esteemed holy by all mankind, fell down before their own sacrifices themselves and sprinkled that altar with which was venerable among all men, both Greeks and barbarians, with their own blood. So what he's saying is there's people who have come to offer sacrifices from all over the world, because this is what they were supposed to do, Passover time. It says they've come in to be holy, and they're getting hit with rocks and darts that are being thrown over the walls by war engines or machines of war. And rather than the animal's blood being sprinkled on the altar, he says their blood is being sprinkled on the altar. They're being killed by these things. Till the bodies of the strangers were mingled together with those of their own country, and those of profane persons with those of the priests, and the blood of all sorts of dead carcasses stood in lakes in the holy courts themselves. So he goes on, he says, for thou couldst be he's bemoaning the temple. He says, and now, O most wretched city, what misery so great as this didst thou suffer from the Romans, when they came to purify thee from thine intestine hatred. For thou couldst be no longer a place fit for God, nor couldst thou long continue in being, after thou hadst been a sepulchre for the bodies of thy own people, and hast made the holy house itself a burying place in this civil war of thine. So Josephus is bemoaning. He said, look, this isn't a place of God anymore. I mean, you just made this a place of your own greed in these wars. And it's become a burial place for people rather than a holy place. So the temple is defiled before the Romans ever step foot in the city, and it's defiled at the hands of the Jews. Okay, this goes on for a long time. Titus starves the people out. There's tons and tons of misery that's going on in the city. The faction leaders are abusing people, their own people in the city. You can read all about that in Josephus. And then eventually, one of the walls is taken down by Titus. The Romans come in. They just demolish the city, and they demolish the temple. That's the long story short right there for you. And Titus is supposed to have said that they were not supposed to burn the temple down, but they did. And so that was the end of it. So Jesus has just said not a stone is going to be left on the temple site, stacked on one another, and this is the fulfillment of that. And it happens within the lifetime of the generation that he's speaking to. So everything is fitting together with the context that we've been talking about. Now, Jesus' instruction. He's telling his followers that when they start to see some of these signs, they are going to know that things are going to get bad, and they need to do what? Verse 16. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in the house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. When they see the city surrounded, they're supposed to flee to the mountains. They may have saw that when Vespasian was there originally. Maybe it was when Titus initially surrounded the city, but they were still able to get some people out, and Titus let them go. Not exactly sure which one that was, but certainly the approach of the Romans probably should have tipped them off to the fact that this was coming. And again, Eusebius writes that the Christians did get out and they escaped to the city of Pella and started there, because we do know that there was a significant number of Christians in Jerusalem. We know that from the book of Acts. Now, verse 17 and 18, they gave me a significant amount of trouble when I was studying this. Not because they're in and of themselves difficult. He says, let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. Look, if they need to get out quickly, or else they may die, this makes a lot of sense. Don't turn around to get your cloak. Don't go down into your house to get anything. Get out of the city. Easy enough, right? Well, that's not so much my problem. My problem was that these verses appear almost in the exact same wording around very similar context in Luke chapter 17, Luke chapter 17 isn't one of our parallel passages. It's another passage in another context. And in that passage, I think Jesus is talking about the end of the world, not the destruction of Jerusalem. And he uses this same statement. Don't go into your house to get anything. Don't go back in the field to pick up your cloak. If he's talking about the end of the world and Jesus coming, like, what sense does it make to say to people you can't go back and get your cloak? Or not to go down in your house? Like, what difference is that going to make? And I think when we read this and understand it, we need to understand it as kind of the big principle that Jesus is communicating here. Not so much that he's literally telling people that they can't go back to their house and pick up any provisions they need, or he's literally telling people that they can't turn around and pick up their cloak in the field. But I think instead he's communicating a bigger principle of preparedness, that he wants them to be in a state of readiness. And they need to be alert, they need to be ready, they need to be sober-minded enough to be able to recognize the signs of the time and to know what was coming. And if we understand it in that kind of wider sense, it can fit in both passages. So in Luke 17, talking about the end of the world, obviously we need to be ready. We need to be watchful for the Lord's return, the day of judgment. We always need to be ready for that. And here in Jerusalem, it also makes sense because they're supposed to be ready, watching for the signs to make sure they're going to be able to get out when the time comes. He mentions there that they should pray that their flight is not in the winter or on the Sabbath day, or he says, woe to those who are pregnant. Two of those make really obvious sense to me. Winter and pregnant. It's really hard to run when you're pregnant, I guess, they tell me. It's also, no one wants to take a journey to flee in the winter because it's going to be cold. But what about the Sabbath? I've heard some people say that, oh, well, the gates of the city would have been closed on the Sabbath day. We read some of that in the Old Testament. So that's why they should pray that it's not on the Sabbath day. I thought, maybe, but the gates of the city are probably already closed if they're under an invasion, right? So why not the Sabbath? Well, you think about it. The city was prominently Jews. And even though the Christians didn't respect or didn't practice the Sabbath day in the same way that the old Jews did, they were in a city full of Jews. So if you're walking around all over the place in the city and no one else is on the streets because it's the Sabbath day, probably going to look a little bit suspicious, especially if you're carrying any provisions, because they weren't supposed to carry burdens on the Sabbath day. So if you got a bunch of stuff, that would have looked super suspicious because you've been the only one on the road with anything in your hands probably, or anything heavy at least. Or it would have been especially weird if you were traveling with your whole family on the Sabbath day trying to escape the city. And if you were going out of the city, you were only supposed to walk a certain direction on the Sabbath, or that'd be weird. Only supposed to walk a certain distance on the Sabbath day. So if you're walking out of the city, like no one would have left the city because you wouldn't have been able to come back in. You would have run out of steps. And so you would have looked really weird, even being a Christian in a Jewish city on the Sabbath day, looking like you were trying to escape. And anyone who was trying to catch deserters, you'd probably be pretty easy to spot, right? I think that's probably why Jesus says that here. Let me know if you can think of any other reasons. And so all of this makes sense. Everything we just looked at makes sense in light of this being the destruction of Jerusalem, interpreting the text this way. Let's take a look at verse 21. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. When the Christians escape, there's going to be a great tribulation. Tribulation, man, people understand this word all kinds of different ways. But keep it in the context, right? What's the tribulation? The tribulation is the horrors that the Jews within the city who don't escape are going to be facing, not only at the hands of their own people and the three warring factions, but also at the hands of the Romans. Josephus tells us that there was, he says 1 million. That number may or may not be accurate. 1 million people killed in the destruction of Jerusalem. They were starving to death. They resorted to cannibalism. The leaders of the factions were raping people and mistreating people, and it was like a horror show. I don't think we appreciate how terrible this was, but Josephus in his Jewish Wars, which I spent some time reading, preparing for this, he kind of brings all of that to life in a terrible kind of way. So that's the tribulation. It's what these Jews are going to have to endure under this abomination of desolation and the Roman siege as a whole. Verse 22. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. If the Romans had continued slaughtering the Jews, not only in Jerusalem, but all of Palestine the way that they had been, there wouldn't even have been a Jewish nation left. God says that for the sake of the elect, or the faithful Christians, those days were shortened. Now, I've heard all kinds of people try to speculate on what the exact event where things were shortened, or what led to the shortening, and not been convinced one way or another that we can know for sure. Probably not that beneficial to speculate, but we know that in some way, because of the faithful of God, this siege, this violence on the Jews was shortened. Verse 23 through 26 now. I need a drink. Verse 23 through 26. For if anyone says to you, "Look, here is the Christ," or "There he is," do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, "Look, he is in the wilderness," do not go out. If they say, "Look, he is in the inner room," do not believe it. Excuse me, do not believe it. Again, Jesus is giving a warning about false teachers. Excuse me. Jesus is giving a warning about false teachers and false Christs. And they were to ignore anyone who was claiming that Christ had come back. Specifically here, this idea that Christ had come back kind of in secret, that he was like hiding out in the wilderness, or he was in an inner room. He says, anyone who says that to you, don't believe them. And he's going to tell them why in verse 27, because the coming of the Son of Man is not going to be something that's hidden and secret, but Jesus coming in vengeance upon Jerusalem is going to be something that's very obvious. Verse 27, he says, "For as lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man." If you have a streak of lightning that goes all the way from one side of the sky to the other side of the sky, it's going to be real obvious, right? There's the flash. Even if you don't see it directly, there's the flash, there's the thunder that follows it. He says that the coming of the Son of Man is going to be like that. It's going to be obvious to everyone. And certainly the destruction of Jerusalem fits that picture. But he uses language here that's interesting. He doesn't say the destruction of Jerusalem is going to be like that. He says the coming of the Son of Man is going to be like that. Now, why do I equate those two things? Because when we think about coming of the Son of Man or coming of God, God is coming, we think, oh, the second coming, it's going to be the end of time, it's Judgment Day. Everyone's going to be, sent to heaven or hell, or that's what we think of. But is that the way that the Bible always uses the term, the coming of God or the coming of the Son of Man? Because as we've already observed, we're running into this verse right in the middle of a context that seems to be talking about destruction of Jerusalem. This is before verse 34 that says all these things are going to happen before the generation passes. So what are we talking about here when it says the coming of the Son of Man is going to be obvious? Let's see. Let's first evaluate that assumption that the coming of God or the coming of the Son of Man is always a reference to the end of time. I think when we look back at the Old Testament prophets, we find that it's not. In Isaiah chapter 19, verse 1 through 14, this is a prophecy about punishment that's coming on the people of Egypt because they're rebellious to God. And it reads this way: "An oracle concerning Egypt. Behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and comes to Egypt. The idols of Egypt will tremble at his presence, and the heart of the Egyptians will melt within them." It says the Lord is coming on a swift cloud and comes to Egypt. Now, does that mean that the Lord is actually making like a physical bodily appearance to judge the people in Egypt? Well, no. It means that he's coming, his presence is going to be felt, and that his judgment is going to be enacted on these people who are rebellious to him. Revelation chapter 2, verses 4 and 5, Jesus says that he's going to come to the church at Ephesus if they don't rekindle their love for him. Does that mean he's going to actually like show up and sit in the pew? No. It means that, figuratively, he will come and they will be punished if they don't straighten themselves out. Matthew 16, verse 28, which is a verse we've already talked about probably referencing Acts chapter 2 when the church is established, talks about, Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, there are some here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." It says some of you will still be alive when the Lord comes in his kingdom. We said that's probably Acts 2 and the establishment of the church. Did Jesus physically come back down to the earth when it says that he where is that? See the Son of Man coming in his kingdom? No, but they saw the signs that the Lord was present and was active in the events that were taking place around them. And I think this is the way that we should understand this passage. So the coming doesn't always refer to a physical appearance. So when we look at this, how should we understand it? It's my understanding that we should interpret it as a non-physical, providential coming of God. His presence is felt in the judgment that he's bringing down on the Jews in the destruction of Jerusalem and in the destruction of their temple. God orchestrated the desolation of their house. Jesus says that this coming is going to be obvious and clear to everybody. So think about what he's just said. Don't believe these people who tell you I'm coming in secret. I'm coming like lightning, and everyone's going to know it. And what was... oh, the last verse. I haven't done the last verse yet. Verse 28. He's hard to pull it all together when you're missing a piece. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will be gathered. This is another verse that gave me some trouble. And again, not because it's found in this context. Let me tell you the way I've typically heard this verse interpreted. We've got corpses and we've got vultures, or the King James translates that eagles. Wherever the corpses are, the eagles are going to be gathered. Well, the eagle was a symbol of the Roman Empire, the Roman army. And corpses were going to be in abundance during the destruction of Jerusalem. In fact, Josephus writes that there were so many corpses in Jerusalem even before the siege, people dying of starvation and being killed by one another, that they weren't burying them anymore. They were just throwing them over the walls of the temple, and they were just their bodies laying in the valley there. So people have said, oh, look, where the eagles or the Romans are, there's going to be lots of corpses. That's what this verse means. If it was only here in Matthew 24, I'd say, cool, that makes perfect sense to me. But this one also appears in Luke chapter 17, which appears to talk about the end of the world. And what do we do with it then? I mean, there's not going to be corpses and eagles and vultures flying around at the end of the world that I'm aware of. So we can't necessarily interpret it as the Romans and the corpses at the destruction of Jerusalem. And I don't want to have two different interpretations for the same phrase. That doesn't seem quite correct to me. So again, I think we should look at this as kind of the bigger principle rather than the specific characters of the statement, the corpses and the vultures. What's the big principle that Jesus is trying to communicate here? Where did I put this in my notes? Oh, yes. Many people have suggested that this is kind of a cultural proverb. We've all got like old sayings that we use that are supposed to impart some kind of wisdom. Some people have suggested that this is one of those. I think it's a statement about conditions being right. When the conditions are right, these things will come to pass. When the conditions or where and when the Lord deems that the conditions are right, the Lord will fulfill his plans. How do I get that out of that? Well, you think about vultures and corpses. Vultures, vulture will see an injured animal and it won't go in right away to eat that animal. What will it do? It'll circle around in the sky, right? We've probably all seen the cartoons. Circle around in the sky until the animal is dead. And then when the conditions are right, when vultures do their thing, they come in and they'll have dinner, right? But the conditions have to be right first. From what I'm told, there's no word in this language, in the original language, to distinguish between eagles and vultures. If anyone knows differently about that and I'm wrong about that, let me know. But my understanding is that there's no word that distinguishes between those two. And so his reference to vultures here is valid if the way that the English Standard Version translates it. And vultures are waiting for the conditions to be correct. When those conditions are correct, you will find the vulture on the corpse. Here, what Jesus is saying, and now we'll tie all this back together, is he says, don't believe these false Christs who are saying that I'm coming in secret. It's not going to be that way. I'm going to come like lightning. Everyone's going to see it. It's going to be obvious. The destruction of Jerusalem was obvious. And they're asking the question, when is this going to happen? And Jesus' response, in part, is when the conditions are right, my judgment will come upon these people. What were the conditions? Well, in part, as we read in verse 23, the Jews still had to fill up the measure of their fathers. There was still wickedness that was going to be performed, that had to be performed before this judgment was brought on them. Kind of like the statement in the Old Testament where there's a nation called the Amorites, and he says the Amorites, their wickedness is not yet matured. It's not yet full. He knows, God obviously knows everything. He knows the way that the Jews were going to react. He knows the way that the Amorites were going to react. He's saying that they're not yet wicked enough for me to bring my judgment on them. And I think that's what Jesus is saying here. When the conditions for this are right, when the Jews have filled up the measure of their fathers, they will be, judgment will be brought on them. So I'd be interested to hear. Maybe there are people who think it is valid to interpret it two different ways in the two different texts. I don't personally like that, and so that's my best shot at reconciling and harmonizing that statement with both of those contexts. Whew, I need another drink. Now, verse 29 through 31, these are probably some of the more tricky passages in the text. Luckily, the end gets easier, so got to plow through these bad boys, and then we'll have an easier road. Verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the earth will be shaken. Sounds like the end of the world, right? Sounds like apocalypse, right? If it wasn't in this context, well, let's look at two important principles for interpretation before I go ranting. Number one, this is stated before verse 34. Jesus said this was going to happen before this generation passes away. We've got to interpret it that way. I'm looking outside, the sun's out, the stars haven't fallen to the ground yet, the moon's still giving its light. Apparently this, hasn't happened. And although it sounds like apocalyptic language, you've got to interpret it within the context it's found in. If the context demands that it needs to be taken more figuratively, then we need to take it more figuratively. Number two, so that's the first one. Remember, the context it's found in. Number two is that the Old Testament uses very similar language to this. So just like that last passage, when we looked at the Abomination of Desolation, how is this being used? Is this language that's been used before? And the answer is yes. If you're a Jew and you know the prophets, you're going to be somewhat familiar with this language. It's a language of judgment. It's not a language of the end of the world necessarily. Isaiah chapter 13, verse 9. This is a condemnation of the nation of Babylon and some judgment that's going to come on them. And this passage is used to describe, this passage contains very similar language here, but again, not about the end of the world. Behold, the days of the Lord come, cruel with wrath and fierce anger, to make a desolation, desolation, and to destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. Not about the end of the world, about judgment on a wicked nation. Keep that in mind as we're looking at judgment on a wicked nation. Now Ezekiel chapter 32, verse 7 and 8. This is about Egypt again and their condemnation. When I blot you out, I will cover the heavens and make their stars dark, and I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give its light. All the bright lights of heaven will I make dark over you and put darkness on your land, declares the Lord. Blotting out the sun, blotting out the moon, blotting out the stars, not apocalyptic language, or not into the world language, but talking about judgment. So how should we understand this as we find it in a passage about punishment on a wicked nation, speaking specifically to Jews who would have been familiar with this language? We need to understand this as, this too is referencing back to the destruction of Jerusalem. And just a side note here, this might be easier for us if we were a little bit more familiar with the prophets. And admittedly, some of the prophets are just hard. and I'm not as familiar with the prophets as I should be, but we might be less likely to misinterpret if we had it in the back of our minds. Wait a second, I've heard this before. Because that's what the Jews would have been thinking. Wait a second, I heard this before. I heard this in synagogue when somebody was reading Isaiah. Now Jesus is telling us that's going to happen to us? Maybe I should pay attention. Don't sleep during the sermon. That's your application. Don't sleep during the sermon. Okay, verse 30 and 30. Let's see if I missed anything on that. Oh, the second half. Wait. 24. Okay, verse 30. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. This is a point where you're going to want the notes, because I included two different translations in this passage, and there's a reason for it. I don't typically do that, but I've got the ESV, which I use currently most of the time for my study. I got the King James Version, which I used most of my early life. And there's a difference here that I think makes a difference. Okay, I'm going to try to read this for anyone who doesn't have the notes in a clear way and point out the passage that's different, and then I'm going to read it in the King James. It's the first phrase of this passage. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. So what do you have there? You have a sign appearing in heaven, and it's the sign of the Son of Man. Okay, here's the King James. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Now you might be like, I didn't hear anything different. There is a difference here, and it's based on which translation you use. And let me just say, I've been told, if anyone knows better, again, correct me. I've been told both of these are grammatically correct. And so it's not a matter of like one's right and one's wrong. They're both grammatically correct from what I've heard. It's just it's up to the translators. What's the difference here? If you use the ESV, it's the sign that appears in heaven that belongs to the Son of Man. So the sign is in heaven. If you use the King James Version and also the American Standard Version and also the New International, the NIV, then it's the sign of the Son of Man who is in heaven. So, splitting hairs, I know, but it's important. ESV says the Son, ESV, New King James Version, and New American Standard Version. They have the sign being in heaven, whereas the other translations have the sign, the location of the sign, not distinguished, but the Son of Man is in heaven. Now, why does that matter? I think it matters a lot in your interpretation because the location of the sign matters. That determines what the sign is. If the sign is in heaven, I'm not really sure how to interpret it. Maybe just, in a figurative sense, as we are dealing with figurative language. But in the King James, ASV, and NIV's translation, I know how to interpret it a lot better. Let's dig into this now that I've probably thoroughly confused you. The translation determines what or who is in heaven. If the first translation is taken, it is the sign that appears in heaven. If the second translation is taken, it is the Son of Man who is in heaven, and the location of the sign is not specified. That's why I need to stay on my notes. In my opinion, Not because I know the Greek. I don't know the Greek. I have been told, but I don't know the Greek. In my opinion, based on the English translations, if all other things being equal, the second interpretation makes the most sense to me, that of the King James, ASV, and NIV. The Bible often uses the term sign to speak about a physical reality that confirms a spiritual truth. The sign of the rainbow is given to Noah to confirm the covenant of God. The sign of circumcision is given to Abraham to confirm the covenant of God. The sign of Aaron's rod that budded is given as a sign to warn the people that they should not grumble against God, or else God will take action against them. These signs can also be thought of kind of as evidences to a particular truth. What then is the sign of Matthew chapter 24, verse 30? It is the sign that signifies the Son of Man in heaven. The sign appears as evidence confirming the truth that the Son of Man is no longer on earth, that he's not dead anymore, that the apostles didn't steal his body, that he has returned now to God, and it is confirming the words that he spoke against the Jews when he was on earth. What sign confirms that the Lord is sitting on the throne of heaven? The answer is the destruction of Jerusalem. Why? Because Jesus is the king, right? Jesus is the king. He is in charge of the kingdom of heaven. And anything that stands opposed to that kingdom of heaven is going to be destroyed. Look at the parallels of the Old Testament references we've looked at before. God's people, anyone who has stood against God's people and God's purposes is cast down with language of the stars falling and the moon being darkened and things like that. They've rebelled against God. They've been hindering his people, and so judgment is brought on them. Now, what is Jesus communicating here as we get into chapter 24? He's communicating that the kingdom of heaven is coming. And again, anything that stands up against the kingdom of heaven is going to be destroyed. Any rebellious nation that seeks to undermine the advance of the kingdom of heaven is going to be shown that the king is on the throne. And what we have from the Old Testament to the New Testament is all these nations stood against the Jews in the Old Testament, but now it's the Jews who are standing against the purposes of God. They are hindering the gospel, and so they are going to be punished and judged in the same sense as their enemies in the past. Now they're judged for fighting against the kingdom of God. And this is evidence that the Son of Man is in heaven on the throne, and that any nation, even the nation of the Jews that had been his people for a long, long time, if they'll stand against his purposes in his kingdom, they will be judged just like all the other nations. This parallels a verse in Daniel. There's a prophecy there about a stone that's cut out of a mountain, and it destroys all the other kingdoms of the earth. All the other kingdoms rise and fall, but the kingdom of God stands forever. I imagine that the Jews never thought that they would be one of the nations that had to be punished and judged because they stood in the way of the kingdom of God. We often think of those as Babylon, Persia, Rome, the Assyrians, Greece, whatever. The kingdom of heaven has outlasted all of them, but the kingdom of heaven is also going to outlast anyone in the future who stands against them. That includes the Jews. The Jews have stood against Christ and his message. They've denied him the glory and honor that he deserves, and now the King of heaven is coming back to punish them just like he punished all the people in the Old Testament. I think that is what the sign is, and I think that's the bigger way to understand everything that's kind of going on in the kingdom of heaven here. But anyway, yeah, that's the sign. The fact that Jesus' words about the desolation, about the abomination of desolation, about your house being left to you desolate, about filling up the measure of your fathers before you're judged, Jesus said that while he was on earth, and the Jews mocked him. And in 70 AD, Jesus shows up. He comes down to the earth in judgment on those people to show them that they should have honored him because now he's on the throne. All right, we've got to press on here. Where am I? I went on a tangent. Okay. Now the second part of that verse, which says, Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, or we took the King James Version, but then all of the tribes of the earth will mourn. So there were Jews scattered throughout all of the world, And no doubt some Christians probably also would have been mourning at this destruction, this punishment. And we see language in the prophets about the earth kind of mourning over these nations that were destroyed. Similar thing going on. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. We already looked at Isaiah chapter 19, where that same language is used. He came in riding on swift clouds and comes to Egypt to judge Egypt. So same picture here. We won't get into that anymore. Figurative language, obviously, not a physical coming. Verse 31 then. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Let me just admit here that there are people who want to interpret this as being the end of the world, and I see where you're coming from. Like, I see where you're coming from. If this verse existed just by itself, and I picked it up and read it, I would be like, that's about the end of the world. But if the context demands that we can't interpret a verse that way, then we can't interpret it that way. No matter how much it sounds like it might be referring to that, obviously it had to have been understood in a figurative way and was said with the intention of being understood in a figurative or a spiritual way. So let's dig into this. What does it mean? Who are the angels? Well, if you're familiar with the Greek word for angel, angelos, I think it is, it's the same word that is used for messenger. So yeah, it can refer to like the heavenly beings, but it can also refer just to a messenger. And that's, I think, looking at it in that messenger sense is probably the way that we're supposed to understand it here. It's used that way in Matthew chapter 11, verse 10, talking about the messengers, or talking about John as a messenger who was preparing the way for Jesus. Also Luke chapter 7, verse 24, where John's disciples come to Jesus and ask him a question. That parallels Matthew chapter 9. His messengers are called angelos, or they're messengers, but it's the same word for angels. So it is possible to take that understanding of the word. These are messengers who have a trumpet. When a king wanted to make a proclamation, he would send out his herald and he would go, boo, boo, boo. And then he would be like, on decree of the king, you need to pay more taxes or something like that. A herald had a trumpet to make an announcement. So we've got a messenger. He's a herald. He's a trumpeter of something. And what is he trumpeting? He's trumpeting in order to gather the elect from the nations of the world. In a sense, Christians are trumpeting a message. They are messengers of God's gospel, his good news, trumpeting and heralding that out to the world in order that through their preaching, the elect might be gathered to God, right? So that's the way I understand this verse, what Jesus is referencing here. Again, highly figurative, obviously. Context demands that. But I'd be interested if you had come across any other interpretations of that as well. So that's what I've got for that. Now, we're kind of through the really hard stuff. Verse 32. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branches become tender and put out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. If you missed our lengthy discussion on fig tree botany in Matthew chapter 21, you might want to go back and look at that. It'll help you understand this passage better. When a fig tree is going to sprout its new leaves for the year, those happen at the same time as the little fig buds, and it happens about late March, early April, Passover time. So, April. And what he's saying is that when you see those leaves, you know that summer's right around the corner. April's passing by, about mid-spring, summer's right around the corner. He's saying you can interpret that sign and know when summer's coming. He says what you need to do is interpret the signs of the times in the same way. As when you start to see these signs, this destruction, this judgment that I'm going to bring on this wicked nation of the Jews, it's coming. And so be ready for it. Watch out for the signs. Keep your eyes open. Now, I don't know if it's a coincidence or not that Jesus uses the fig tree here, because if you remember earlier, I mentioned that Titus's army showed up about April. right about Passover time. And it's thought that the city was really swelled with people because there were a lot of people coming in for the Passover feast, which would have happened every year. Titus surrounds the city right about that time of year. Whether that's a coincidence with Jesus' illustration or not sure, but literally, when the fig leaves would have been coming out, Titus would have been marching through the fig leaves to arrive at the city of Jerusalem. Verse 34 and 35. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. I need another drink. This is our very important verse that helps us with our context. He says, all these things, all this stuff that I've just described, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Pretty straightforward statement, right? Everyone, this generation is going to see these things happen. So the most obvious, the most fitting, the historical account that fits all of these criteria is the destruction of Jerusalem. And so that's the way that we should interpret it based off of everything that we have here. It all fits into place. Otherwise, you basically just have to discard this verse. I mean, if you're going to interpret it some other way to say that this is something that's happening at the end of time, you basically have to throw verse 34 out. Obviously, we can't do that. He says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. He confirms the security of this prediction. There will be a day when you see the coming of the Son of Man, and they will evidence the fact that his words were true and that he's sitting on the throne. Verse 36 then, this is our transition. This is our transition from the first part of the apostles' question to the second part, the end of the age. When are all the Jews going to say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord? It's going to happen at the end of time. He's already answered the first part. He's given them the signs that they asked for. He's like, here it is. Here's the information. Going to happen in your generation. There's the answer for your first part. Now, leading on to the second part, and this is going to extend into chapter 25, he says this. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. If you're careful, and you notice the language that's in Matthew chapter 24, you can see this change happen. Not to mention there's obviously a reference here, but we'll look at that in a second. He uses this phrase, I think for the first time in this chapter, that day. It's a specific day. It's a singular day. All throughout the discussion of the destruction of Jerusalem, in verse 19, he says, those days. In verse 22, he says, those days. In verse 29, he says immediately after the tribulation of those days. And then when we come to verse 36, he says, but that day, signifying, he's talking about something different now. Now, we're going to see that here in a little bit. That day is an interesting statement because in the Bible, that day often is often used to, my wife is calling me. Hello? Hello?
What are you doing?
Filming.
Oh, you freaked me out. Don't do that.
Okay.
Love you, bye.
Love you. I hadn't responded to her text messages, so she had to call me. Make sure I wasn't dead. I have a good wife. I'm basically married to a saint. Life is easy when you're married to a saint. But anyway, drink break. Where was I? Oh, this term, that day, is often, is kind of, it's used many times to refer to the end of time, even when there's no context around it necessarily saying that it's referencing back to about Judgment Day. Examples can be found in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 12, and 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 18. There's some others, but I just included those. Pretty easy to look at, both in the same chapter. But they reference that day. Paul talks about that day, even though he hasn't made another reference to Judgment Day in that passage. So it's it's understood that that's what that specific day refers to. Maybe probably pick that up from Jesus here. Now, so as we mentioned, even when it's not in the immediate context, we can understand it that way. But here, we are given it in the immediate context. Don't let the chapter subdivision, if you have one between 35 and 36, throw you off. Because he's just mentioned that day. And that day is what? Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. That day is when heaven and earth pass away. It's right there, in the context. And what's that? That's the end of time. But of that day knows no man. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. So here's the big shift. We see that unlike the coming of the Lord in 70 AD, Jesus' coming at the end of time will not be time-stamped with a bunch of signs. I know there's a lot of people who teach that there's going to be lots of signs. Excuse me. When Jesus comes back, there are not going to be signs that allow us to pinpoint the exact day, hour, time when the Lord is going to return. Now you could say, well, what about 2 Corinthians chapter 2, when Paul says that the Lord can't come in judgment until the man of lawlessness is revealed and the rebellion happens. Well, that is the case. Paul's writing saying, at least to them, this can't happen until these events take place. But that in no way indicates a year or a time or a century or a millennia in which the Lord will return. He's just saying this has to happen first because they're concerned that they missed it, right? They missed the coming of the Lord. Now for the difficult part of this verse. The difficult part is, it says here, no one knows the time that the Lord is going to return, not even the angels, not even the Son. Okay, who's the Son? Well, the Son's Jesus. Is this a difficult verse? Yeah. If we claim that Jesus is the Son, and the Son knows everything, then how is it that, if we claim that Jesus is the Son, and the Son is God, and God knows everything, how is it that Jesus doesn't know when he's coming back for the world to end? Should we conclude that Jesus isn't God? Well, I don't think that's a reasonable conclusion, obviously, because Jesus has made claims to deity already in the Gospel of Matthew. You think his claim, I am the Lord of the Sabbath, I am Lord over the laws that God has created. That's a claim to deity. That's a claim to equality with God. Think about John. John is actually one of the apostles who is listening to this discourse on the Mount of Olives, and his conclusion is not that Jesus isn't God. We know that because he writes in the first chapter of his epistle that Jesus is God. So that's not the conclusion that we need to draw. So how can God not know something and he still be God? Well, I think it's important to remember that we're dealing with Jesus in his incarnate state here. And I think the best explanation, and there's huge amounts of theological debate on the answer to this question, but I think the best explanation is that Christ willingly relinquished the knowledge of that fact at the end of time. He willingly relinquished the knowledge, at least while he was in his form as a human being, had union with the human form. We know that Christ relinquished some of the privileges of the divine in order to become human, to experience life as a human. For example, Matthew 21, fig tree, says that Jesus was hungry. God doesn't get hungry. God never gets tired, but Jesus slept. God is everywhere. He's omnipresent. But there was a sense in which Christ limited himself to space when he comes down into the human form. God is not dependent, and yet when he is in the wilderness and in other occasions, he's ministered to by angels. Well, why? There's other examples that can be given. It may have been the case that Jesus willingly forfeited some of his divine knowledge, and this was one of the facts that was given up in that process. Why would Jesus relinquish that knowledge when taking on human form? It's difficult to say. And speculation may not be super valuable to us here, but I think it's possible that it was necessary in some way in order for him to have union with the human nature. Now, that could be, unpacked for days, probably. And I'm not even sure that, I definitely don't understand all that is behind that, but it is possible. And we just don't know enough, I think, about the nature of God and the exact details of the incarnation to say whether or not there were things that were necessary for him to relinquish for a time in order for him to step into the human form and have union with the human nature. I think that's possible. I think that's probably something along those lines is probably what we're dealing with here. Now that Christ has returned to heaven and is, back in his glorified state, this may not even be true any longer. He may know now and have all of that information. But I think that's probably the best way to interpret the verse. It's a hard verse. I mean, plain and simple, it's a hard verse. And but obviously, based on everything that we've read and will read, the conclusion isn't, oh, well, Jesus isn't God. That just doesn't make any sense. Otherwise, he claimed things that weren't true. In which case, he's not a very good, perfect lamb to be sacrificed if he's lying about things. A side note here, King James Version does not have the words nor the Son in Matthew's account, but it does have it in Mark chapter 13. So even though it's not here, even if you have the King James, you still have to deal with that when you get to Mark's gospel. Verse 37 through 39. And I think I copied this in the King James Version. Let me read this in the ESV. I looked at Mark's thing in the King James and then I ended up not changing back. Verse 37. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. So what is the judgment going to be like? What's the end of time going to be like? It's going to be like the days of Noah, when you had all of these people, they were going about their business and living, in their wickedness, which is why God destroyed the world. And the flood started coming and the rain started coming, and it was too late for them to make a change. Right? It's too late for them to be saved at that point. It came upon them very suddenly. He says the judgment day is going to be like that for people who are unprepared. In verse 40 and 41, then shall two be in the field, and one shall be taken and the other left. Two women shall be grinding at the mill, the one shall be taken and the other left. On Judgment Day, as we mentioned, there's not going to be signs that pinpoint the day, and so people are going to be going about everyday business, just like in the days of Noah. And then what's going to happen? He says, two people are going to be in a bed, one's going to be taken, the other left. Two people are going to be at the mill, one's taken, the other left. What's that a reference to? Probably referring to verse like 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 17, where we're told that the faithful in Christ will meet him in the air. So there's going to be, the faithful are taken off the earth, meet the Lord in the air. That's probably what it's talking about here. Two people in a bed, one is taken, the other one's left. Two people in the field or in the mill, one is taken to meet the Lord and the other one left. I think that's probably what it's getting at. The faithful will be selected out of the world, one from a bed, one from a field, one from an office, one from a high school, one from the mill, and will be brought up to meet Jesus. Verse 42 and 44, we're almost done. Watch therefore, for you know not what hour your Lord doth come. But know this, that if the good men of the house had known in what watch the thief would come, he would have watched and would not have suffered his house to be broken into. Therefore, be ye also ready, for in such an hour as ye think not, the Son of Man cometh. If a thief wants to show up at your house, he's going to do it when you least expect it, right? Not going to leave you a bunch of clues the week before to tell you when he's going to show up or, let you guess, unless he's especially maniacal. But no, he's not going to leave you hints for when he's going to show up. And in the same way, rather than providing any hints about when Jesus is going to show up, he says that he tells the apostles to watch because he's going to return when the world isn't expecting it to happen. Now, the last section, verse 45 through 51. Who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom his Lord hath made ruler over his household, to give them meat in due season? Blessed is the servant whom his Lord, when he cometh, shall find so doing. Verily I say unto you, that he shall make him ruler over all of his goods. But, and if that evil servant shall say in his heart, My Lord delayeth his coming, then shall begin to smite his fellow servants, and to eat and drink with the drunken, the Lord of that servant shall come in a day when he looketh not for him, and in an hour that he is not aware of, and shall cut him asunder, and appoint him his portion with the hypocrites. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Have you ever thought that your boss was going to be out of the office, and everyone in the office like sloughs off, because the boss is gone, but then he or she like shows up later in the day, and you're all like not doing what you're supposed to be doing? I might have done that before, maybe, but that's kind of the idea here, is that there's going to be. Now I'm flustered. Don't do that. Don't do that. That's bad. You're supposed to work for the Lord even as you work for your boss even as you work for the Lord. Don't follow my example. It's a bad example. Anyway, this is the kind of what's going to happen. God has given us work to do, things that need to be accomplished in the kingdom that we've been responsible for. We've been in charge of stewarding our blessings and our lives and our energy and loving people and all these other things that Jesus has given us to do while he's away and while we're children and servants of his. And when the Lord comes back, like, how is he going to find us? That's the question. If he finds you or me to be sloughing off, he's not going to be too pleased. He wants us to be watching, waiting for him. And if our minds have been given over to all these other things, worldly things, then, obviously that's not going to be pleasing to the master. This parable is going to kind of continue on in theme and in substance as we look at the next couple, at the next couple parables. So the chapter break ends here, but when we look at the parable of the 10 virgins and then of the talents in Matthew 25, we see some similar themes running through those. We're done. That's Matthew chapter 24. So I hope that it's been beneficial to you. And get the notes. There's so much more in the notes, so much more writings of Josephus that will really shed light on a lot of this stuff and other stuff as well. So get the notes. Thanks for hanging with me. Thanks for being patient as I studied for this. And we'll be back on the 2-day schedule. So we'll do Matthew chapter 25 in 2 days and hopefully finish out Matthew. I just combined all my notes for Matthew. And we ended up having, through chapter 24, ended up having 260 pages. So should be over 300 for the final book of notes. And so that'll be a great resource, I think, for a lot of people, hopefully. And it'll be nice for me not to forget everything that I've taught. So thank you, everyone. Again, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Share the video. Let me know your comments, thoughts on any of those passages down below. Maybe you view it differently, and I'd love to discuss that with you. And thanks for taking your time out of your day to watch this. I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for your support.